to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Mark Chiusano. He is a Newsday journalist whose new book is called The Fabulist: The Lying, Hustling, Grifting, Stealing, and Very American Legend of George Santos. Mark Chiusano, welcome to Current Affairs.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Your title is great for reading dramatically.
It was fun. You know, honestly, it took me a second to come up with it. I had a really bad one at first, and then this one came, and I was like, this is way better. This is the way to go.
Well, there's a lot in here. There's lying, hustling. It will cover lying, hustling, grifting, stealing. It's kind of amazing that you got this book out so fast, because obviously George Santos has only been on our radar for what seems like a fairly short amount of time, but you've been covering him for about as long as anybody has been.
Pretty much. I'd been writing about him for Newsday. I actually wrote a piece about him when he launched his campaign in 2020. It was just a little kind of blurb for our newsletter, you know, kind of saying that he was running. The funny thing, though, was that, you know, my editor said, give him a call. So I did. And I reach him and he says, oh, I'm launching my campaign today, but I'm actually in Florida right now. And that's where I'm doing it from. It's like, okay, that's weird. You know, not the right way to do it.
Because he was not running in Florida. And so.
Indeed not. Yeah.
So, yes, what were the points that you, as a journalist, having seen him from the moment that he started the campaign, what were the first tip-offs that something was a little off about this guy?
Yeah, so that was one strangeness, that he's launching from this other state. And then in that conversation, it's funny, I went back and looked at the little blurb I wrote. I think the kicker, or like very close to the kicker, is that he hadn't uploaded any campaign finance filings yet, as you're supposed to if you're running. And I noted that in the piece, and he said, oh, it's coming. It should be there soon. I already sent it in, you know. So he was already making excuses about not following the rules, you know, and trying to do things differently. And it just kind of continued. I mean, he wasn't really running that actively in 2020. You know, it became COVID pretty quickly, right? So that, you know, slowed him down, obviously. But even still, he was just doing strange things. And so I would duck in from time to time and write about the weird things he was doing. Like he had this kind of maskless fundraiser during COVID. In the next cycle, he wasn't living the place. You know, it was unclear where he lived. He maybe wasn't even living in the district. And yeah, just kind of, he kept providing fodder for these little pieces.
Yeah. Well, before we dive further into what you've covered, maybe you could just remind us, for those who just need a refresher on what the general pattern of lying, hustling, grifting, stealing by George Santos is. Could you just remind us of some of the more egregious things that he is found to have done that have made him such a notorious figure in American public life?
Totally. So I guess you kind of have to separate it into two categories. One is the lying, and he has a sort of wild amount of crazy, lurid lies about his biography. So he's said in various ways that he's Jewish or Jewish. He does not appear to be that type of religion in any sense of the word. He has said that he had a career on Wall Street, worked at certain banks that he didn't work at. He said he went to colleges that he didn't go to, and he went to a fancy private school, Horace Mann, that he never attended. He said he was a producer on Spider-Man on Broadway, which he was not. It's also a hilarious play to pick because it's kind of a bad play and closed pretty quickly. All these things, anything you could think of, he's kind of made up about his background. Volleyball. He said he was a championship volleyball player in college. He was never on the team at a school he didn't go to, right? It's sort of double lie. Mm-hmm. So these are all the lies. And then he, of course, was sort of grifting the whole time. This has been a pattern in his life, he was sort of hustling for cash. In the beginning, it was kind of low-level stuff, right? He was stealing from family, friends, roommates. Later on, reporters turned up kind of bigger things. He had this sort of fake pet nonprofit that was supposed to help people who, needed help for their pets. And he was kind of pocketing cash from that, including for a Navy veteran who was homeless at one point. Really sad story. And then, in the political world, he's doing all sorts of grifting. He's using campaign money for all sorts of inappropriate things, like the low level, like just sort of going out to dinners that you're not really supposed to be, to the sort of truly insane stuff, like literally stealing donors' credit card information to pocket money, or putting that money literally just into his own bank account, using it to pay for things like Botox. Truly, truly wild things that lots of politicians get caught for one little thing on that front, maybe an inappropriate use of funds. He really runs the gamut.
It's quite staggering. And your book is full of these kind of jaw-dropping, egregious, shameless, brazen lies and bits of petty theft. I mean, this is the sort of guy who will just he just drops lies as casually as you and I might just speak it as any ordinary sentence. At one point, I seem to remember he's talking to his campaign treasurer and he just says he has brain cancer and is getting treated for brain cancer.
Yeah. And a really
and then just never brings it up again.
Yeah, no. And it's a really sad one too, because with that treasurer, her husband died from cancer. And so he kind of has a way of like taking details from people and then spinning them back onto himself. The funny thing too is obviously the book is sort of chock full of all these lies and grifts, but I've continued to collect them even after the book was done. Someone called me just a day or two ago. They once kind of, was associated with him, worked with him a little bit, took him over to the house for dinner one night, meets this person's wife, and Santos claims that he knows this woman's boss, right? She works at a kind of medical facility, claims that he knows the boss. There's no way that he knows the boss. It's just like a random person that there's no reason for him to know. And he sticks to the story and he gets like aggravated. He's like, of course I'm not lying. I really know this person. It's just, he can't help himself.
It's very strange. I mean, he will just do things like, someone meets him in Boston, so he says that he's starting a PhD at Harvard. And then he never mentions it again. Or it's like, oh, if you bring it up, he's like, oh yeah, I left the program. As you mentioned, they are so bizarre and unnecessary.
Yes.
Like you mentioned in the book, the volleyball team lie. He's like talking to people who know something about volleyball.
Yeah.
Because their daughters play volleyball, and he just embellishes it to the point where you go, why are you pushing a volleyball lie right now with this audience? There's no strategy of, I'm going to tell lies that I won't get caught on with this person because this person won't know enough. You're like, no, this person will definitely know enough to know you're lying.
Totally. There's another crazy one that I write about in the book where he's literally in a debate with his Democratic opponent in 22. It's sort of a softball question. It's sort of at the end. It's something like, what do you and your family do for, holiday traditions? And the Democrat says some boring thing about, whatever. I'm in my sweatpants and I have Haagen-Dazs, something like that, with my family. And then, the interview returns to Santos and he says, yeah, I just love kind of gathering with my family and eating Haagen-Dazs. And the Democrat looks at him like, I just said that, why would you do that? It seems to be something that clicks in his head and he can't help it.
Well, we are presented with a number of mysteries in this book. One of the mysteries, of course, is why would any person do this? And you're a journalist, not a psychoanalyst, so I don't know that you can get us to the bottom of that mystery. But there's another mystery, which is how does a person who does this end up in the United States House of Representatives? That is a mystery that I feel you as a journalist are equipped to help us understand a bit better.
That's right. Well, and I do think on the first mystery, I enjoyed sort of tracing all the details and trying to give people a sense of what might be going on in his head. On the second one, I think that it's a real structural kind of institutional question. There are many kind of structures that someone hits up on in their run towards Congress, right? And at many moments, various institutions could have blocked him, stopped him, and didn't, right? And I don't think it's like a failure of one in particular. It's kind of many, many failures altogether. It's a little bit of I call it a perfect storm election with him, that so many things went right. So, one thing was that the political parties, right, didn't sort of find his full story. right? The college thing in particular, that's a very easy thing to check. And the sort of vetters didn't do that on the political level. The crazy thing, though, is that they kind of found a lot of stuff. The Democratic campaign arm that sort of does these sort of reports found a wild, like dozens of pages of sketchy things that he'd done, including past, work history and financial stuff. The problem, same thing with the journalistic side. I was one of them, and there were other reporters who were poking small holes in his story, raising questions about weird things he was doing. But none of us kind of connected all the dots and said, oh, everything is weird and fake about this guy, not just 5 or 6 things, And I don't know if our system is perfectly equipped to find a sort of full fabulist like that in the very, at the first moment.
Another thing is that George Santos is running as a MAGA Republican and a big fan of Donald Trump. And to do that, to be that person, you are kind of telling a bunch of crazy, exaggerated falsehoods all the time, nonstop, and distinguishing those from, outright fraud is not necessarily easy. I mean, you mentioned that one of the things that was a little weird was he had a big maskless fundraiser, but that's kind of par for the course for today's Republican Party. They're all
totally right
on COVID. They're all COVID deniers. So that's a red flag by normal standards, but not by 2020 Republican standards.
Another red flag, I also saw 2 more red flags that I wrote about during the campaign. He was retweeting QAnon slogans, right? And QAnon obviously is this kind of crazy conspiracy theory that now a couple of members of Congress have sort of brushed up on, right? And spread the theory themselves, Marjorie Taylor Greene being one of them. And so that was a whole, I both had to explain to readers what is QAnon, what is the problem with QAnon, and then to say, oh, George Santos, was part of that, or at least kind of spread it a bit. He claimed he didn't know what it was. So that's one. And then another was, of course, the election denying stuff. Santos was really big on that front, really following Trump's footsteps. He actually showed up on January 5th at that big rally the day before the whole Capitol thing, saying my election was stolen, just like Trump. And so people wrote about that. And again, it's like inappropriate, crazy behavior. That's also what the Democrat who was running against him in 22 chose to highlight. He was like, this guy is an election denier, right?
Yeah.
That was the message that worked all around the country for Democrats. Didn't work in New York for a whole bunch of reasons.
But it's interesting because that message is George Santos is a liar. This guy is lying about everything because obviously the election wasn't stolen. And so, but as I say, like, it's like, no, he's worse than a huge liar. He's a huge liar. No, like, really?
Didn't you hear me? He's a liar. Yeah. I mean, it's funny the sort of what people are sort of gravitate towards, what sort of tells the story, right? Sometimes I wonder if any one of these institutions had gotten, for example, the college story or the Brazil check fraud case. I think those are things that kind of paint the picture better and say, oh, yeah, this is different. This is not just a run-of-your-mill crazy politician.
Although, to be honest with you, I would rather have members of Congress, obviously he's both. If I had to pick one set of lies, I would rather have members of Congress who lie that they've gone to college when they haven't than members of Congress who delegitimize our democracy through lies about substantive issues. And yet it's those sets of liars who are the kind of legitimate Republican liars. And it's George Santos who's like, no, you're doing the bad lies where you actually lie about your personal history.
In some ways, the sort of biographical lies, are more understandable to us. And so we gravitate towards them. I wrote about this too. When he was in Congress, sort of floated, both before and after, was always floating these kind of crazy conspiracy theories about vaccines. He proposed a Nicki Minaj vaccine bill that was, sort of trying to, it spread a bit of COVID misinformation, just like Minaj did. He also said on Twitter Spaces after the, Hamas attack on Israel that we should go into a, quote, police state in the US, and that we should go door to door. It was very vague on what the point was, I guess, to prevent terrorism. But, these are truly dangerous things for an elected official to say, different from just saying, oh, yeah, I did or did not dress in drag.
Well, this gets us to another mystery of George Santos, which is how does a gay, not Jewish, but Brazilian man who has, or of of Brazilian, he's born in the United States, but of Brazilian family, child of immigrants, who apparently has performed in drag in his life, become a hardcore right-wing MAGA QAnon Republican.
Yeah, I mean, there's an irony there, obviously, right, in that it goes counter to some of the stuff that he would say later in terms of his policy positions and that the party itself promulgated. But I think that actually that was exactly why he was picked. So this was the Nassau GOP, to give it credit, is this sort of storied political machine, right? Very, very strong. Ronald Reagan supposedly said that when a Republican dies and goes to heaven, it looks a lot like Nassau County. Like this is how sort of strong the GOP is in this part of the country. And yet they sort of understood that the Long Island is diversifying, new groups are coming in, they have to find candidates, for these different communities. And so George Santos was exactly who they were looking for to counter some of the Democratic focus on identity and et cetera. So he probably would not have gotten this nod at another time, and if he wasn't the sort of identity that he is.
Ironic that identity politics.
Truly identity politics, yeah.
He must also be quite charismatic. I mean, obviously, I've never met the man. You've spoken with the man.
Yeah.
It does seem, the ability to convince people of egregious falsehoods. I mean, you write about his kind of early life when he was doing a legitimate job for a short period of time where he, was a call center worker, and he was a very good call center worker because this is a guy with the gift of gab, it seems.
Exactly. He can spin a story, he would talk about in that call center job, he sort of convinced everyone around him that even though he's working for $12 or $13 an hour, actually he has a trust fund and he's like vacationing in Dubai and all these kind of wild things. And he makes people believe it. He's very charismatic. He's very tall, by the way. So, people don't really realize that about him. And he's quick on his feet. There was a moment on the campaign trail where, his opponent had been painting him as this true extremist, which in most ways he is. And his response to that, very shrewd, was something like, oh, I'm not extreme. I'm just your wife's gay best friend. A very clever and sort of disarming way to prevent that attack, and these are the kinds of things that helped him.
He also, I have to say, there is something kind of likable about him. I hate to use that word, but I know I've talked to plenty of people who find him hard to hate, or they think that, the lies. I mean, he's a horrible, horrible person. He's worse than Trump. I mean, maybe he might be worse than Trump. I mean, Trump never did the thing where he killed a veteran's dog.
The dog is tough. He has a real trail of victims behind him, So, I mean, you can't lose sight of that. He hurt people. He stole money from poor people. There's a woman who's living in a favela right now, in no small part because of the money Santos stole from her. So, this is it's not a joke, right?
Seriously, he is a horrible, horrible human being.
But I think you're totally right that there is something very likable about him. There's also something very sort of understandable about him, or he is very of his generation. He is very kind of funny and bumbling in the ways that, I am sometimes, or many people I know my age, in terms of like how they talk, right? Or how they kind of trip over their words or fix things later. He's very relatable. And I think, again, that helped him too, and is gonna help him in his post-prison life.
Oh, yeah. I mean, his cameo videos are already so successful, he's doubled the price because people want the cameo videos.
They're very good. They're very funny,
They're funny.
Yeah.
You call it a very American legend. And this guy, I don't know that he will make it into the history books, right? It's like a minor episode in American politics in a certain way, but it's a very illuminating episode in American politics in another way. And there are parallels with like Boris Johnson and Donald Trump himself, who also have this kind of roguishness, right? That people like, or I think you use the word anti-hero as well, which is that there is something about us that likes a bad guy.
Well, he's entertaining. And yes, he's kind of sticking it to the elites and he couldn't go to a college, so he made it up. He pretended. And there is something very appealing about that, right? Because we're all searching for this kind of American dream, which doesn't really exist in the form that, is commonly accepted. And so George Santos shows another way to get it. He himself is fascinated with entertainment and celebrity culture and gossip. I went through all these kind of old social media posts of his before he got interested in politics. He was super into the Real Housewives, Miley Cyrus, like this is kind of his world. This is what he's made of and what he's interested in. And no surprise that America, which is interested in all that too, would kind of gravitate towards him.
You have a point in the book where you talk about how someone like some small-time hustler approaches you and tries to like sell you a ring, as happens in the streets of New York, where a guy comes up to you with a story and it's an obvious fraud. And most of this type of guy ends up there. And George Santos does not. He ends up in the United States. He wins his election, and he wins his election by quite a few points.
Convincingly. Yeah. I mean, it's wild. And then, by the way, just to kind of extend that story, there was a world where he doesn't even get seated, or he gets seated and gets kicked out immediately. That did not happen. He lasted almost a year in office, This is a guy who succeeded. He was a congressman.
He was a congressman. He will always have been one.
One of whatever, 11,000 or whatever it is in history. It's fascinating. To me, I think that's what's emblematic of the story, because he traced all those normal grifter paths, right? He kind of dabbled in lots of different hustles, but the one he chooses ultimately is politics. And politics is available for that hustle. Like, he sort of shined a light on a lot of the ways that you can hustle in politics. So it's like a leaky ship. And it also is sort of at the center of American culture right now in a way that other businesses or pastimes were in the past. But right now, maybe it's fading a little bit, but for the past at least 5 years or so, politics has been right at the throbbing heart of the American conversation. And so I think that's what drew him there. And it's also what makes him interesting as a figure in American history.
And he might spend a few years in federal prison, but I feel like he's going to land on his feet.
I kind of agree. I mean, he says anyway that he's made plenty of money from Cameo. It does seem like the receipts are there to some extent.
I bet he has.
Yeah. So I think that, he's not gonna go quietly. That's just not been his ethos for the last few years.
He'll slap his name on stuff and people will buy it because of the irony factor, and
it's funny, I also think this is what, you mentioned Trump and Boris Johnson. I think this is what's both kind of appealing and also scary about someone like Santos, is that on the appealing side, he doesn't have access to the nuclear codes. He's not like raising a finger and that's right.
I don't know how this could end. He could be president. Who knows? This could get worse.
No, and I mean, I think that's the sort of scary part, because he is, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, love them or hate them, they have real resources behind them. And it's not surprising that an entertainment mogul would be able to win the presidency. Or for Boris Johnson, this extremely well-educated and talented man would be able to turn the sort of dark arts towards his own benefits, right? Santos has no money, no power. He has to lie about all the things that he says he has. And yet that lying and scheming has allowed him to rise to the highest levels. So will it just be easier for people like that to kind of continue scheming their way up in the future?
He could have been legitimate, though. He has the talent. This is a strange thing. He came from nothing, essentially, or he came from a working class immigrant background. He didn't come from any of the things he said he had, right? So in a way, as you say, he is kind of an American dream story, and that he's like, but it also does seem like, I don't know, if he'd stayed at not necessarily if he'd stayed at the call center, but if he'd if he'd scaled back some of his most egregious pathological tendencies, he might have made it to Congress without this stuff.
Absolutely, because like I was saying before, the Republican Party was looking for a person from a different generation, a different community, needed someone like that who still held the Republican policy line. those views, they needed someone like that. So he easily could have gotten that. There was actually literally a Republican candidate from Nassau County who did not complete college, recently. So it's not as if the college thing was all that important. It needed to be a litmus test for the party. He could have claimed that story in a really excellent way. I don't wish he was still in Congress for various reasons, but, it would have been fascinating to see him run in the spring in a primary if he had stayed in office.
Because he would have done it.
I think he would have done it, and it would have been before his trial date, right? And it would have been fascinating to see how that vote shook out and how many people just said, knowing everything they knew about him, yep, I still like his policy positions and I like his vibe and he's funny. Yeah, so why not?
Yeah. And trust in and respect for Congress is so low that people almost like, he's not, honest grifter is an oxymoron, right? He's not, but Trump has this quality too, where he's like, it's almost like he barely pretends to be telling the truth, so you almost trust him more.
Yeah, there is some weird double crossing going there. But there is a way that he kind of fits everyone's stereotype of a politician anyway, and he just adds on a little bit of fun stuff on top.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program. You've mentioned at some point in the book the fork in the road, and you're like, there was a point at which George Santos could have stayed legitimate, and there was a point where he just became an outright grifter, paying people with fake checks for their dogs and fake pet charity. Just, again, heartbreaking stories, a horrible person. Did you find George Santos's first lie?
Right. Well, the problem is that I think it came pretty early, His mother used to call them his stories. That's what I was told, that she would say, oh, it's just Anthony and his stories again, not lies. You can sort of, in that, I think you can extrapolate a certain sense of weariness over these having been occurring for so long. He also was stealing from his family members. His aunt, Elma, who again was an immigrant from Brazil and is literally, along with his dad, she's responsible for keeping him out of jail right now. She and his dad are the ones who kind of posted bond for him. They don't have a ton of money, and they're the ones that are on the financial line, letting him hang out and do cameos now, And this is a woman he stole from. He mooched off his grandmother in Brazil, elderly woman. So it's just, I think that he's been doing this kind of thing for a long time. To me, what the change is when he decides to go into politics, because then it's you can't really hide those grifts forever, right? Eventually you're going to get found out. There's just too much paperwork. And that to me is the other central mystery of the book and of him, is sort of why pick politics?
Where there's scrutiny, scrutiny from journalists.
At least a little scrutiny, and more. And I don't know, I think there's a little bit of a, it's almost a cry for help on one level, sort of, if you want to be an armchair psychoanalyst, more sort of journalistically, I think that it was, this was sort of the big thing. And he's always gravitating towards the most celebrity focused, hottest spotlight. And so it was politics.
Has he ever admitted any of this stuff, like stealing from family members? Is he just a pure sociopath who feels bad about none of it, apologizes for none of it, just hurts people all his life? Does he make performances of regret?
Yeah. He's apologized for some of his lies and some of the sort of misrepresentations, at least to his district. But he always kind of does it with a smile on his face, And he disputes a lot of the other sort of monetary things and says it's not quite the way it is. But this is sort of the challenge of reporting on Santos, is it's really hard to prove negatives, right? And I think it's our sort of journalistic impulse to say, you catch someone in a lie and you go to them and show it to them, and then they kind of say, all right, you got me, or they double down and they say, no, you got it wrong. This is, I'm telling the truth here. And so he has doubled down on a number of things. Like, he continues to claim that he went to Horace Mann, right? He continues to claim that he has Jewish heritage. So,
and you've checked with the school.
I mean, not only, so I went beyond that, because I was like, I don't know, let me do my best. So I went to Horace Mann. The institution said, we looked back at records dating to, I forget the date, but like early 20th century, and they couldn't find anyone. Then I look at the yearbooks. I got, the yearbooks for the time he was there. I turned every single page looking for a picture of him. He's not there, but this woman, Gabriela Santos, is there. So I call her. I'm like, oh man, did I figure it out? Like, is it a cousin or something? It's not. But she's like, yeah, it's a pretty white school. I would have remembered if there was another Brazilian descendant here who's named Santos. So it's like, this is the kind of the holes you go down trying to see what's true and what's not.
Yeah, it must have been a challenge to report on someone who has woven such a web. Were there things that, I mean, since you've covered it more than anyone else, were things that people didn't know were false until you didn't know were false until you looked into them and you were like, oh, that's not true either.
Right. This one's fake too. Well, one weird one was, he said that he was born at 24 weeks gestation, which is like very early. And, I tried my best to prove or disprove it. Family members don't remember anything about that. And you look at the records and it's super unlikely that someone in that time, whatever, it's like, it's not a great statistical chance that it's true. So then it's like, I both had to sort of figure out the facts and then figure out, like, why was he telling this lie? Like, what's the point? Sometimes I think, like you were saying, it is just random and he just kind of lies for no reason. But sometimes it seemed to me that there was a sort of deeper reason that he reached for this lie. Like with the 24-week one, I think he has always sort of, a bunch of his lies cluster around the number of obstacles he's had to climb, and that he's always sort of overcome things. And so I think that in some ways, some of those lies can be telling.
How does he explain? Does he have an explanation for, or does he just avoid the one about his mom dying on 9/11?
That's another one that he's doubled down on. And he says, this is the story I've been told, that she escaped the towers.
But I thought he also said that 9/11 claimed his mother's life. Didn't he say?
Yes. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. I guess that one he's backed off of. I don't know. Maybe charitably I don't know. I can't remember the wording of the tweet. Charitably, maybe you could say he misspoke or something. But that's another interesting one, because we, again, you're a journalist. You try to sort of be as careful as you can. So the reason we know, or we don't think that 9/11 story is true, is because her own immigration paperwork, his mother's, says she was in Brazil at the time. Yet Santos himself claims, that she was there. So it's very difficult. One funny moment I had reporting this was, I'm talking to people at the middle school that he went to, and he would have been in middle school at the time of 9/11. And turns out that there's like a window from that middle school where you could see the towers coming down. And he was there. He certainly was there at the time. So it's funny that he kind of intersects with all these moments of American history, even though he is kind of a minor figure in the end. But he kind of, I don't know, he's an interesting American legend.
Well, it does strike me that, all the work you have to do to try and figure out answers to this stuff. Truth is very elusive. It's a very precious and difficult thing. And as you mentioned, if someone says they went to Horace Mann, how do you prove they didn't? Right. How do you prove that someone isn't Jewish? And they say, oh, well, the paperwork, I don't know what happened to the paperwork, but, the school is wrong. What do you do? I mean, can you ever 100% prove that someone didn't attend that school? You can say, oh, well, no one remembers him. The school doesn't. But, and it'll just come up with some additional explanation for the facts that you've uncovered.
And it's a real kind of flaw in the science of journalism in a way, because we have to do our best to kind of, the more scientific we make it and the more sort of precise we say exactly what we know, honestly, frankly, the more boring it is, right? Like, you don't want to hear like a long explanation of everything I went through to say whether he went to Horace Mann or not. You sort of just the reader wants an answer. Did he go or didn't he go? And so then when journalists give direct answers, sometimes we make mistakes, and that leads to all sorts of problems. So it's why I think journalism is in this sort of very difficult moment, because good journalists anyway are doing our best to, scratch towards truth and explain when we make mistakes, and people are impatient.
Well, I wanted to ask you, because you must have felt at a certain point, I wish I uncovered the depth of this earlier, before he got into the United States House of Representatives, because you covered him from the beginning. You've been covering him for years, and so you must have thought, okay, how do we as journalists make sure that we find the real story and we don't just get a few things but miss the giant thing that should be staring us in the face? What lessons come of this for the kind of reform we need? Because in a way, it is a failure of, not, as you said, not just journalism, but of the parties. I mean, I don't trust the Republican Party to weed out these people, but, of a lot there. We need institutions that can keep grifters and thieves from entering the House of Representatives.
Totally. Well, on the journalistic side, time helps, right? And resources help. I mean, it's a real irony for me. I spent a lot of time making sure that a different Long Island congressional candidate went to the college he said he did, because that college was Annapolis. And that is something that a journalist rings a bell in a journalist's head. And you say, oh, this person is claiming they went to this military academy. We want to make sure. We're not going to allow him to say this if it's not true. So I filed records requests and followed up and called again. And you spend time on this. And he went, right? That is typically how it goes, is you do your checks and, nothing comes of them. That takes time. So sure, if more journalists had more time, that would be great. Some of it is dumb luck. I actually was working on a story that was another kind of sketchy thing about Santos's work history that I couldn't finish because I couldn't get the quote, and I couldn't get the person on the record to help me with it. That's a shame. If I'd gotten it, I don't know, maybe more threads would have been pulled in time. And then, of course, some of it is both journalists have to figure out how to tell these stories in an interesting way, and readers have to kind of help us and be interested and kind of read these things and focus on these things and give us their eyeballs. So it's a complex ecosystem that a lot of people trying to do the right thing. Voters don't have time to vet these candidates themselves. They're relying on us too. So it's not their fault either. But all of these failures let someone with ill intentions to get through.
I gotta ask you before we close, what does he think of you?
I don't think he's a fan. He has said lots of demeaning things about me to other people, which I always find kind of funny. He's kind of replied to the book sideways in a couple of funny ways. He's called it both a fable, which I think is really funny because it kind of is a fable in a way, right?
Not wrong.
I don't think in the way he means it. And he's also called it fictitious, which I also find funny because what part is fictitious? His parts or my parts,
And he hasn't actually refuted anything you've said, and he's been given ample opportunity to.
Oh, and I reached out many, many times offering him the chance to do that, and nothing since either.
Yes, he's like, stop stalking me or whatever. He's whatever.
Right. Yeah, he said, stop knocking on the doors of my family members. And it's like, well, that's what New York City journalists do. We knock on lots of doors.
I haven't followed the criminal charges closely. So where do things stand now with this guy?
So he appears to be talking to prosecutors about a plea deal. That's been happening for a while. So who knows if it'll actually pan out. He's lost his real bargaining chip, which was being in office. I mean, that's huge. And now he doesn't have that anymore. So he's in trouble. He has a trial date set for September. By the way, I think it's very funny. One of the reasons the trial isn't going to happen until September is because the judge has some other cases, but also she said in court that people don't like serving on jury duty in the summer, which I think is hilarious. Probably true, but that's pushing it back. If he doesn't take a deal before then, seems like he'll be in court in September, and it's a real challenge. It's a lot of paper that he's faced with, some very straightforward charges that it's going to be difficult to refute.
Oh, I just saw on the back Jimmy Kimmel talking about how stealing puppies from the Amish. He did that too, right?
Yes, yeah, that's another fun one. Yeah.
Yeah, this list just goes on and on.
It's
and on.
crazy.
Stealing puppies from the Amish.
An Amish farmer. There's an incredible televised interview with one of these Amish farmers, and they kind of film the farmer from the back, so you can't tell who it is, but the sort of like 18th century garb or whatever 19th century garb is clear. It's beautiful. It's like he went to everyone. He tried everyone.
God, it's funny. And also sad,
Yes.
for our democracy. As you say, ultimately, I mean, your book is fabulously entertaining, but it is also depressing. I did get to it, and I was like, okay, we need to fix this. There's a problem. And as I say, it's very, as I said earlier, it's easier to focus in on the grifting stuff and the, paying for the OnlyFans account and campaign funds and all that. I'm more frightened by horrible politics. And those people, Marjorie Taylor Greene's still in there because she apparently, just spends her campaign funds correctly.
Right. I mean, the Jewish space lasers thing that she's famous for, I mean, how much less of a lie is that than some of the stuff Santos said?
And a more dangerous one, really.
And I do think it's convenient, for the Republican Party to toss out Santos and say he's the problem, he's the cancer, and without looking at some of these other things.
Yes, that's what not having integrity is. The rest of us have integrity. He doesn't.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anyway, the book is The Fabulist. The lying, I'm going to say this again. I'm going to read the subtitle again because there's so much fun. The lying, hustling, grifting, stealing, and very American legend of George Santos, blurbed on the back by Representative George Santos, who says, I'm really hopeful that the reporter I've had blocked for over a year, Mark Chiusano, has a great imagination. What kind of material comes from his latest grift? That seems like a little bit of projection there.
It's my band's name, Latest Grift.
The latest grift from you. Okay, well, the book is available now. The Fabulist. Pick it up. Mark Chiusano, thank you so much for joining us in Current Affairs today.
Thanks so much for having me.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.